So coming up this weekend is going to be UFC 306, headlined by Sean O'Malley taking on Merab Dvalishvili, but this of course is going to be the event taking place in the Sphere, which is also known as Riyadh Season Noche UFC, so it is a card that is going to be celebrating Mexican heritage, even though it is sponsored by Riyadh Season for some reason. But from what we have heard about this card is it's apparently going to be absolutely insane to watch, not just in person, but also from our viewing experience, because they're going to really be taking most of what the UFC's, well, the Las Vegas Sphere has to offer to really put on a great UFC card. And although I wouldn't necessarily say that this card on paper with the fighters is super stacked, it sounds like it's going to be a very impressive watch, and I actually do quite like the poster for this one. But of course, before I do get into my predictions, I did want to shout out We Want Picks. It is $10 per month, and you get access to a lot: Angelo's bets, Jacob's bets, my articles that I'm putting out super early for Dana White's Contender Series every single week, as well as articles about non-UFC events such as Bellator and PFL. You name it, I've probably written an article about it. With that being said though, now let's get into this card, which is a somewhat short card. It is only 10 fights long. I do think that there is probably going to be a different belt order to this one here, but I am just going to go with what Tapology has right now. And it does have Raul Rosas Jr. fighting Aoriqileng as the opener. I do think this one's probably going to be closer to the main card, but I do think that it is a good showcase spot for Raul Rosas Jr., who is a very young prospect, probably one of the most young prospects right now in the UFC. Not even 20 years old yet, and he's already had multiple fights under the promotion, and multiple pretty impressive wins as well. He takes on Aoriqileng, who is definitely a veteran at this point, 36 professional fights, so it does make sense why you would match these two together, but I do think that it is just a good matchup for Raul Rosas Jr., to be honest with you. Rosas Jr. is going to want to get this fight down to the ground, and I just don't think that Aoriqileng is going to have as good as takedown defense as what Christian Rodriguez did, for example, and I do think that Raul Rosas Jr. will eventually get the fight down to the ground. Now, where Aoriqileng is going to be dangerous is in the striking. Yes, Raul Rosas Jr. has shown that he does have, well, KO power. He knocked out Terrence Mitchell in the first round, and he does have pretty decent striking. His strength definitely is in the grappling, and I do think that he's going to be looking to take the fight there somewhat quickly and probably very early on into the matchup. Aoriqileng has shown very good KO power before. He has knocked out a couple of guys, has had a couple of different sort of performances. He wasn't looking bad against Daniel Marcos, but then he did kind of get kicked, and then he beat Johnny Munoz Jr., which is somewhat of a similar stylistic matchup, I would say, but Johnny Munoz Jr. I just don't think presents the same wrestling or grappling threat as what Rosas Jr. did. He got backed up by Amin Zahabi and knocked out pretty quickly, and he did beat a very common opponent in Jay Perrin, but I just don't think that Aoriqileng is going to be able to defend the takedowns. Rosas Jr. is a minus 700 favorite. I do think he gets a submission, and I do think he gets a submission pretty early on into the fight. And now the next one on the Tapology order is going to be probably a pretty controversial pick by me. It is Edgar Chairez fighting against Joshua Van. I do think that these odds are inaccurate. FightOdds.io is having Joshua Van as a minus 225 favorite, and Edgar Chairez is plus 190. I don't mind picking Edgar Chairez in this matchup, and the reason is he is massive for 125 pounds, man. I mean, he missed weight significantly in his last one in a rematch that he had with Daniel Lacerda, and then he has had also a couple of fights kind of falling out before. But if you watch his fight against Clayton Carpenter, who is a bigger flyweight than Joshua Van, Edgar Chairez looks absolutely massive in that fight. And of course, size doesn't really tell all at all, because Joshua Van, although being quite small for the weight class, is very fast, has very good boxing, and also has very good movement. And to my surprise as well, since coming into the UFC, he has drastically improved his takedown defense, because on the regional scene fighting for some smaller promotions, he was actually getting taken down, not somewhat easily, but he was getting out-wrestled by Paris Moran, he was getting taken down by Cleveland McLean, and then he comes into the UFC, defends the majority of Zalgish Makilov's takedowns, defends the majority of Felipe Boone's takedowns. Charles Johnson tried to take him down twice and couldn't get it done, and he's just looked really good in the takedown defense front. But I do think that this fight is actually going to hit the ground in some way or another, and in the grappling, I think Edgar Chairez grappling is very, very good. He has very opportunistic BJJ. He can latch up submissions from anywhere. He has got some pretty scary submissions. I mean, this win over Gianni Vasquez was a very controversial one because the referee stopped it like 30 seconds too late. It was terrible, but Edgar Chairez is capable of doing that to opponents on the ground, and because he is going to have such a big size advantage, I do think that he should be able to get the fight down in some sort of way over a much smaller Van, and a Van taking the fight on short notice. Now, taking the fight on short notice, I don't think is going to be a red flag, because Van doesn't look like he cuts, well, any weight at all, to be honest. So I'm not really too worried about that, but what I am somewhat worried about is the fact that he did lose to Charles Johnson recently, got knocked out in the third round. On my scorecard, I thought that Charles Johnson was actually 2-0 going up into the third round. A lot of people didn't have that scorecard, which is kind of interesting. I think it could have been 1-1, but not the 2-0 Van scorecards that I was seeing on Twitter, which was interesting. But in that one there, Charles Johnson was able to outstrike Van. It was very even on the strikes, but Johnson, in my opinion, was just landing a little bit harder. And then he did get knocked out in the third round, and that fight was only a couple of months ago. Joshua Van's not even 23 years old yet. He hasn't taken the time away from that fight to kind of look back at that fight and kind of see what he could change, maybe what he could improve on. And he's quickly jumping back in there against another really big guy that's going to want to take him down, has power on the feet, gave Clayton Carpenter problems on the feet prior to these two fights. I think that Edgar Chairez, although I think he is outmatched pure skill for skill on the feet, I think that he does have more power than Josh Van, and I do think that he can get the fight down to the ground in some sort of way and get some ground control time, or even a submission. So I am really going against the grain here. I am picking Edgar Chairez. If he does miss weight like he did miss against Daniel Lacerda, maybe my opinion could change, because this guy's weight cuts do look to be pretty scary. He is massive for the weight class. But another thing as well is you can't forget how he looked against Tatsuro Taira. In hindsight, pretty good performance. He was landing some pretty good damage there, and Taira couldn't really get too much offensive grappling going. Now, Yazmin Jauregui fights against Ketlen Souza. In my opinion, again, this is a pretty good fight for Jauregui to get another, I guess, somewhat comeback victory after a recent loss to Denise Gomes. I know that she did win against Sam Hughes, but now she takes on Ketlen Souza, who is a little bit of an interesting fighter because she is a good striker, but she can grapple as well. But where I think that she is going to be most outclassed in the fight is in the striking against Yazmin Jauregui. Yazmin Jauregui had a lot of hype behind her. She's a very good technical boxer, has had multiple very good performances, has had actually a lot of exciting fights as well, and she's looked good so far. Now, she did lose in just about 20 seconds or so to Denise Gomes, and it is a bit of a shame that that fight did happen and it resulted in the way that it did, but I don't think it was really necessarily due to like a lack of skill. It's not like she got outclassed for 15 minutes. She did get caught and knocked out pretty quickly, but she bounced back against Sam Hughes, who does just kind of continue to prove that she is a pretty tough fighter. She can turn away a prospect every now and then using her wrestling and cardio, but Jauregui's just a really good boxer. She does take on Ketlen Souza, who took on a short notice fight against Karine Silva, and Karine Silva, we now know, is definitely a top 15 sort of prospect. She did get submitted in that one there, but now has come back down to 115 pounds and then got that win over Manik Man, which is a win in the UFC in 2024. Somehow Manik Man's just really, really small for the weight class, and she only is a wrestler. Ketlen Souza kind of just continued to expose the fact that Manik Man doesn't really have any striking, but I do think Yazmin Jauregui does have very good striking, and I think that her boxing and her striking just in general is going to be good enough against Souza, and I do think she can defend the takedowns if she needs to. So I'm going to pick Yazmin Jauregui here. I would be somewhat surprised if she found a knockout win, but I wouldn't mind seeing it, but I do think that the prediction is going to be Jauregui by decision. And now Manuel Torres fights against Ignacio Bahamondes. The odds are very even. I think that the odds are pretty accurate, because although I do slightly favour Ignacio Bahamondes, I very slightly favour Ignacio Bahamondes. Now, there was a time where I was super, super high on Ignacio. I thought that he was going to be a very good prospect to watch out for. A former welterweight, now coming down to 155, where he is just massive for the weight class. Strikes from range and uses that striking from range very, very effectively. A lot of kicks straight up the middle, a lot of push kicks, a lot of long strikes using his range, and he does fight from range. That is his style, and he does use his height and reach very effectively. He takes on Manuel Torres, who I would say is mostly a striker. I wouldn't necessarily say that he is the most technical striker, but one thing that this guy doesn't lack is power. He potentially could be one of the most powerful guys at 155 pounds with this guy's highlight reel that we have seen. Yes, he does have a submission win over Chris Duncan recently, but prior to that, he put out Nicholas Motta with honestly a KO of the year contender for 2023. It was a brutal KO win. Knocked out Frank the Tank Camacho, who was coming towards the end of his UFC run at that point, and then of course did defeat Colton England in a win that has aged pretty well, because I think that Colton England has now gone on like a 4 or 5 fight win streak since that win on the Contender Series, so pretty good win for Torres. But in this matchup though, he could potentially close the distance, and Ignacio Bahamondes, I would say, has somewhat disappointed me with performance recently. His loss to Ludovic Klein, I don't think has actually aged terribly at all. Ludovic Klein just continues to look better and better and better, but I did kind of like his size in that matchup, and he wasn't really able to keep Ludovic Klein from distance, who is very, very small for 155. Then he does knock out Christos Gialgos, but at this point, who hasn't? I do think that Bahamondes can keep the fight at range, and I think that at range, that's where he's going to be most safe, because I think that Manuel Torres packs most of his power, not necessarily in his straight shots, but more in the closed distance shots. Like, he's got that massive elbow win, but he's also throws with a lot of powerful hooks and knees and just kind of close range weapons. So I do like Bahamondes to use his long range weapons to keep the fight at range, and then win, I'm going to say by decision, unless maybe Torres slows down. We don't necessarily know how good Torres' cardio looks late into a third round. I'm going to pick Bahamondes to win a decision in this matchup though. And now Irene Aldana fights against Norma Dumont. I have a pretty hard time picking this fight here, because I feel like Irene Aldana really disappointed in her fight against Amanda Nunes, and that fight kind of changed my opinion of her, because I genuinely thought, although I did pick Nunes, if someone was going to beat Nunes, it probably could have been Irene Aldana, just because she genuinely does have really nice boxing for women's 135 pounds. And against Nunes, it kind of just looked like she was scared. She wasn't really throwing much at all. She just kind of showed up for the whole fight, and overall it was a pretty disappointing performance, which is why I didn't think that she was going to really come back so good against Karol Rosa. And against Karol Rosa, she did just kind of showcase what she's good at, which is the boxing. She does have grappling, she does have good takedown defense, but what everyone does know Irene Aldana for is that boxing, that striking that she does have. Norma Dumont is also a little bit of a striker. She does kind of mostly mix in her striking with her wrestling and her grappling, though. Did have a pretty good striking performance in a fight which I think is a little bit older now, against Chelsea Chandler, where she was actually hurting Chandler on the feet. Had that pretty funny meme where Chandler gets rocked and just runs away. That was that fight that it happened in. But recently as well, of course, she has now moved down to 135 pounds, which is a weight class which I think a lot of people didn't think that she could make, because she was fighting at 145 pounds, was not looking like a small 145 pound fighter at all. In fact, had actually missed weight at 145 in the past, but now with women's 145 out of the way, now she has to fight at 135, so she does have a pretty tough weight cut here. I actually think that both girls would potentially have a pretty tough weight cut, because Irene Aldana has actually struggled with her weight before. I believe she missed weight against Yana Santos, and I think that the fight against Macy Chiasson, both of them missed weight, so they moved it to 140 pound catch weight fight. So an interesting one here. Both of these girls might struggle to make 135 pounds on the scales, but I am going to go with Irene Aldana to win this one by decision. Although Norma Dumont did use her well-roundedness to beat Jermaine Durandamy, Jermaine Durandamy, despite taking a lot of time off, actually looked pretty good in the loss to Norma Dumont, I thought, and I thought that maybe you can kind of look at this fight as well, and Irene Aldana can kind of see a lot of the shots that were landing on Norma Dumont and emulate a game plan for that one. And I do think that as well, Irene Aldana, now that she has kind of lost the title shot, and now she's 36 years old, it's kind of now or never. So I'm going to go with Irene Aldana. I think that she can get it done by decision. Very low confidence pick though, because I do think that Norma Dumont could use her size advantage. I do think that even though she's going to be a bit smaller in the height and reach department, I think that she still probably will be the stronger fighter. So maybe you could see takedowns, maybe you could see clinch control, but I like the boxing of Irene Aldana, and it genuinely is quite good for this weight class. And just like that, we're already at the main card. It has come pretty quickly. And for some reason, Ronaldo Rodriguez is on the main card taking on Osbourne. I really think that you could put Raul Rosas Jr. in this spot. In fact, I think it would be more appropriate. I do know that for some reason, Ronaldo Rodriguez does actually have a massive following on Instagram. But yeah, I'll be honest with you guys. I wasn't sold on Ronaldo Rodriguez coming into the UFC. And I'm still not sold on Ronaldo Rodriguez now that the fight has happened against Dennis Bondar, because if you do watch that fight back, he looked really slow for 125 pounds. Like, he did look slow. He genuinely did. Like, Dennis Bondar would slip over, I believe, pretty early into the fight, and Luis Rodriguez wouldn't react until, like, Dennis Bondar had already stood up, and then Bondar would, like, throw something, and then Rodriguez would, like, wait a second and then counter it. It was just a really weird fight, and I feel like on the feet, he still looks very uncomfortable. He looks pretty slow. He's got, like, no reaction time at all. And I just worry about his ceiling, man, because he looked like that on the regional scene years ago as well, and I believe even prior to that, he had fought on the Contender Series, and he lost, actually. He lost the decision on the Contender Series to Jerome Rivera, man. I did, yeah, and then if you watch the fight, his fights, he does look slow. He's mostly a boxer, but like his boxing isn't that like crisp. Doesn't really have the best technique necessarily. And then his fight against Bondar, as I said, he just looks really slow, and you cannot be slow for 125 pounds. And someone that isn't slow is Osbourne. Despite Osbourne having a lot of flaws, he has lost quite a few fights in the UFC, and this really could be his last if he doesn't get the win. Osbourne has got really fast hands in the boxing, and that's probably actually his best attribute, is being fast on the feet. And I think that's Ronaldo Rodriguez's worst trait. So if the fight takes place on the feet, I like Osbourne to win this one. But I do still like Ronaldo Rodriguez's grappling a lot, because in that fight, even though Dennis Bondar was finding a very surprisingly high amount of success on the feet, Bondar was still going for the takedowns, and Rodriguez was defending, and even if he did get taken down, he would throw up submissions, he would defend submissions, and he would turn those positions into more dominant positions for himself. So I think that if this fight gets down to the ground, I like Ronaldo Rodriguez to win the fight a lot. But if this fight takes place on the feet, I think that Osbourne has a real shot as winning as the underdog, because although he has lost quite a few fights, of course, in the UFC, lost to Zellhuber by submission, somewhat of a similar matchup, but not really. Asu Amabayev was a tough fight to get, man. He did beat Charles Johnson, but he didn't. If that makes sense, he was given a decision, which he probably shouldn't have got. But yeah, I think that Osbourne's got a real shot. I know that this breakdown for this fight was a bit of a mess, but I just kind of wanted to say I'm genuinely not that sold on Ronaldo Rodriguez, man. He does look slow. He doesn't look very reactive for the weight class, but I do think that he can go out there and defeat Osbourne here. And now Daniel Zellhuber fights against Esteban Ribovics. If you guys know me, you know that I'm a big fan of Esteban Ribovics. He's all offense, no defense, and I still think that he does fight like that. I do remember being very, very high on him coming into the UFC, because I absolutely loved his performance against Thomas Paul on the Contender Series, because if you watch that fight starts and Esteban Ribovics runs forward, just throwing constant volume, man, and it was a fun fight. I know that it got interrupted by a kick to the midsection, I guess you would say. He just kept going, and he got a 90-second KO win. Was meant to fight Kamala Kirk, ended up getting Loic Ratsabov on short notice. Tough fight, showed pretty bad takedown defense, I'll be honest, even though he was hurting Ratsabov a lot on the feet. Same thing, showed pretty bad takedown defense against Kamala Kirk, but was able to come back in round 2 and 3 with a striking and win it after getting not dominated, but controlled for the whole first round. And then he fights against Terence McKinney, and he knocks him out, because at this point, who hasn't knocked out Terence McKinney? But in this fight, though, I think that Ribovics does have a chance to win as the underdog, and I do think that as the fight kind of gets closer to the fight date, we probably will see more and more money come on Zellhuber, just because I think a lot of people, like very, very casual fans that just want to put money on the sport, will look at the fact that Daniel Zellhuber is Mexican on the Mexican card, on the main card, and you probably could bet Ribovics as a really big underdog. But I still do slightly lean to Daniel Zellhuber in this one here, because I do think, although he can be pressured, and he has been pressured before by Trey Ogden on the feet somehow, he is still a very good boxer, and he's still a very good striker in general, and I do kind of quite like him now that he's finished his studies. I don't think he's a student anymore, so I think he's training full-time, and when he wasn't training full-time, I think during this kind of time period here. But yeah, Daniel Zellhuber, he's a striker for the most part. What he likes to do is he likes to fight from range, again, and he likes to use his range advantage and kind of just box, edge, strike, using his straight shots from range. Ribovics is a guy that's going to want to close the distance. He's a guy that's really going to want to land the big shots, and there is a real chance that he does find a knockout, but personally, although I do love Esteban Ribovics, I just can't really see him closing the distance super effectively against a very technical striker in Daniel Zellhuber, and I do think that he does win. But I do think that, once again, you can look at fights that Daniel Zellhuber has had in the past. He lost the first round to Lucas Almeida. Lucas Almeida is a very similar fighter to Esteban Ribovics, where he is going to be coming forward. He's going to be bombing away on the feet. He's going to be trying to make things happen. And in that fight, Almeida looked really, really good in the first round and really shocked Daniel Zellhuber. Now, that fight was 3 years ago, but there are a lot of parallels to that fight as there is to this one. And maybe if Daniel Zellhuber hasn't really been working on fighting a guy that's constantly pressuring forward, maybe he's going to have some trouble in this one, but I would be surprised if they haven't been doing sparring against someone as crazy as Ribovics. So I'm going to go with Zellhuber still to win a decision in this matchup against Ribovics. Now, Brian Ortega versus Diego Lopes has been rebooked. I still like Diego Lopes. I think a lot of people will probably be jumping off the Diego Lopes train because he didn't look that good, in my opinion, against Dan Ige. We've got to be fully honest there, because in that fight, I think that Dan Ige actually exposed the striking of Diego Lopes. Now, I don't think anyone really thought that Diego Lopes was a technical striker, because he's not, especially if you watch his fight on the Contender Series against Joanderson Brito. A lot of that fight does take place on the feet, and Diego Lopes just kind of does what he does on the feet with his chin kind of pretty high up in the air, and just kind of throwing relatively sloppy hooks. But he is very, very powerful, and he has been able to find success using that by finishing Sadiq Yusuff in that clinch position with the uppercut. Knocked out Pat Sabatini as he was standing up from a failed takedown attempt. Diego Lopes is a grappler, and he wasn't really able to get the positions in the grappling against Dan Ige. But I think another thing as well that you need to consider about that entire situation was the fight was booked against Brian Ortega. To my knowledge, Diego Lopes had cut to 145 pounds. It turned out that Brian Ortega wasn't going to make 145 pounds, so then they made it 155 pounds. So I believe Diego Lopes had to kind of like change his like nutritional diet or whatever to now fight at 155 last minute. And then the fight gets cancelled, so Diego Lopes doesn't really know what he's going to be doing. And then Dan Ige steps in, and he's now at 165 pounds. So I think that there probably was like a very confusing weigh-in situation, nutrition situation, weight-cutting situation in general going into that Dan Ige fight. But in that fight, we did learn a lot about Lopes. He can dig deep still. Although he doesn't really have technical striking and like at all, he is still very powerful. He was landing big shots against Dan Ige. He was finding the same success really in the pocket and the closed range as he has been against fighters like Sadiq Yusuff in the past. And once again, we did see a pretty decent amount of offensive grappling. Now he fights against Brian Ortega, and this is definitely by far, I think, the toughest matchup that he's going to have to date on a full camp. Of course, he did fight Evloev on short notice, but going in against Brian Ortega, Ortega is a guy that has made drastic improvements in his entire game. He was 1-3 at one point in the last 4 fights, going into his Yair Rodriguez fight, a fight which he did lose by that injury, but Yair Rodriguez was beat him on the feet and put him in that armbar that injured him. But in that time away, he really did improve, because then against Yair Rodriguez, who was coming off, I believe, the fight against Alexander Volkanovski, Brian Ortega was finding success on the feet, showed improved striking, and then, of course, eventually ended up working it into his wrestling and grappling and got the submission. So now we're talking about a Brian Ortega who has leveled up. The Brian Ortega that fought that Yair Rodriguez is not the same guy that fought Alexander Volkanovski, I would even say, for example. So we're kind of looking at a matchup here where it is grappler versus grappler, but if it's on the feet, who's going to win on the feet? And I did think this originally, and I still do believe this even after the Dan Ige fight. I think in a striking fight, Ortega is the better striker, but I do think that Diego Lopes is the more powerful striker, and I think he's the more powerful striker by far. This is a guy that I think has shown that he might have some of the most power at 145 pounds. One punch KO kind of against Pat Sabatini, one punch KO against Sadiq Youssef, even though there was a couple of uppercuts in there. I think that on the feet he can knock out Brian Ortega. But now the thing is about Brian Ortega is he's improved. So how much has he improved? And how is he going to look? Because he was actually, I believe he was sick at the UFC 303 weigh-in when he was trying to make weight. So now he's coming back a few months later after being sick. Another thing about Brian Ortega as well is that there's kind of been these rumors circulating that Brian Ortega doesn't want to fight at 145 pounds anymore. He wants to fight at 155 pounds. So maybe he's going to have a tough weight cut. Maybe he does have it somewhere in the back of his mind. He doesn't want to fight at 145. He wants to be fighting at 155. All of these things, whether they're true, whether they're not true, still instill some doubt in my mind about him. So I'm still going to side with Diego Lopes on this one. And I'm still going to go with that original prediction. I am actually going to still pick Diego Lopes to win by knockout, even though he really is a grappler, and we know that grappling is the best part of his game. I do love this fight. I'm very happy that it was rebooked. I still think there's quite a few questions on the Ortega side, and I think there's still some questions on the Lopes side as well that we might see answered in this one here, because it is going to be the toughest matchup that Lopes has had to take on for recently. And that's it. That's the featured fight. So now we can move up to the co-main event. Probably another controversial pick coming up, because I am going to pick Valentina Shevchenko to defeat Alexa Grasso. And my reasoning is for this one here. The thing is, here's the thing. I'm not super convinced that Shevchenko lost that fight to Alexa Grasso. I'll be honest with you. I thought that Shevchenko really should have been given the decision. That could be a hot take. It could not be. I don't know. But looking at numbers, and numbers never tell the whole story. I'm always the first person to say that. A lot of people will say that Alexa Grasso was outstriking Valentina Shevchenko in that fight, and she was. The person that was winning on the feet the majority of the time was Alexa Grasso. She was looking very good on the feet and very good in the boxing. But one thing as well that I think that we learned a considerable amount about in that last fight is the fact that Valentina Shevchenko is willing to actually look to use her wrestling and her grappling, which isn't something that she has really done in the past necessarily. I do believe that when she dominated Jessica Andrade, she took her down like 6 times in 2 rounds, which was insane. But aside from that, she didn't really... Where's Jessica Andrade? This one here. I think she took her down like 6 times in 2 rounds when she finished her, which is kind of crazy. But since then, she knocked out Lauren Murphy. She's kind of dominated her on the feet, really, for the whole fight, let's be honest. Tyler Santos out-grappled her, which I think kind of made a lot of people kind of think that maybe Shevchenko's grappling isn't that good. But in the most recent fight against Alexa Grasso, Valentina Shevchenko was finding the most success in the fight by getting the takedowns, by being in top position and then landing ground and pound there. Now, was it that exciting? Not really. Alexa Grasso wasn't really looking for ways to get up either. She kind of was just relying on the ref to stand them up. So maybe in this one here, Shevchenko's going to have to be a little more offensive in the grappling, maybe move to positions, maybe try and attempt submissions or some stuff like that. But I think that's how she beats Alexa Grasso. In my opinion, the way that Alexa Grasso beats Shevchenko is by keeping the fight on the feet. And for a very long period of time, I think a lot of people would have thought that nobody was going to beat Valentina Shevchenko in a striking match in the UFC because she had looked so dominant in the striking before. Like, if you do look through her career, hindsight's always 20/20, and a lot of these wins have not aged too well. But she did absolutely dominate Lauren Murphy on the feet. She dominated Jessica Andrade, although that really was with the wrestling and the grappling. Has that pretty awesome KO win over Jessica I, and just kind of mostly did win using the striking in her matchups. But now she takes on Alexa Grasso, who I think has actually kind of shown that she can win in the striking. She can outbox Shevchenko. She can beat her on the feet. And I think that's what she did in the second fight. And in the first fight as well, she was finding a lot of success before Shevchenko eventually made a big mistake, gave up her back with a spinning kick, and Grasso just capitalized and got the win with a very impressive choke, because you don't necessarily see in women's MMA that kind of strength in the squeeze so much, so that was very good to see. But I think that Alexa Grasso has to keep the fight on the feet. And just looking at the numbers, I think Shevchenko attempted 6 takedowns in the fight, something like that, maybe 7. And I think she got 4 of them. She took down Alexa Grasso 4 times in the fight. I think if she goes to the wrestling, she can mix in the striking with the wrestling. And I think she can win a decision over Alexa Grasso, get the belt back. Another thing as well, the time away probably does benefit Alexa Grasso the most, because now they haven't fought for a year, which is crazy because these two have just been holding up the division the whole time. And in that time now, Shevchenko's nearly 37 years old. Grasso's still in her prime at 31. So maybe there's something to think about there, but I'm still siding with Shevchenko to win and take the belt back. Now let's go up to the main event. Controversial, I think either way. I think a lot of people are split. I think the odds right now actually favour Sean O'Malley, which is kind of crazy to think about. Bet online right now as I record the video, -120 O'Malley, +100 Merab. I kind of feel like Merab should be the -120 favourite, right? Right? Surely I'm not the only one that thinks that, right? I have been critical of Merab in the past. I will put my hand up and say that. I picked Jose Aldo to beat him. Where is it here? Did Jose Aldo definitely didn't beat him, but I thought that Aldo won a round, and really, if he was just a little bit more active on the feet, could have stolen a second round and won the fight, but he didn't, and Merab won that fight. It was boring and really just sad to see, I'll be honest. And then I did pick Henry Cejudo to beat Merab, and it looked like I was going to be a genius for the first round. Henry Cejudo had a really good first round against Merab, landed some really good strikes on him, was able to defend a lot of the wrestling situations in round 1, but then round 2 and round 3 happened, and Merab just really started to take over using that wrestling, and that's what Merab is best at doing, is the wrestling, the grappling, the cardio. That's kind of it, because he attempted so many takedowns with Petr Yan and just didn't really follow through with them. But the constant pressure and the constant just kind of failing of takedowns and putting him up against the clinch and making Petr Yan work really wore on Yan's gas tank. He's a much better boxer, a much better striker, but because Merab was pressuring forward so much, not really been super effective in the grappling, but he stepped on the gas tank of Yan, man. And he could do that to Sean O'Malley, who is a very big bantamweight. Now, 5'11" bantamweight, we'll have to see. We will have to see, because being 5'11" at bantamweight, like, that's really, really tall, man. So we'll kind of see how he kind of stacks up to Merab in this one here. I don't know if he's necessarily that tall, because I kind of look at someone like Otar Tanzilov, who I do believe is 5'11", and he just looks like a monster in there compared to his opponents. But Sean O'Malley, tall bantamweight, good range, good reach, and that's what he does the best at. Is he is a very, very good range fighter and a very technical striker. Picks his shots very well. I actually picked him to lose against Aljamain Sterling here, in this one here. I thought that Aljamain Sterling was going to out-wrestle him, and this is a pretty similar sort of matchup, really, because you've got the grappler in Merab against the striker in Sean O'Malley. And then he dominates Marlon Vera, but that was just a free title defense, let's be honest. But it's interesting, because we all know that Merab's not that good at striking. We have seen it time and time again. Multiple people have been able to land pretty good combinations on Merab. Like the fight against Marlon Moraes. Moraes was kind of beating him up on the feet for a very long period of time. Jose Aldo was genuinely able to find some success on the feet. Henry Cejudo hurt Merab quite a lot in the first round, and I believe actually if you look a little bit earlier on into his UFC career, there is a couple of other people as well that land a couple of combinations as well on Merab on the feet. So we know that Merab's defense on the feet isn't that good. So he probably is going to need to get the takedown here, because Sean O'Malley is a sniper. Sean O'Malley does do the damage. I mean, he gets KOs. That's kind of what I'm trying to say. And he did look very good against Chito Vera, even though Chito just didn't really do anything until the end of the fight. But I'm torn on the fight. I'm genuinely 50-50. I've kind of been asking around and seeing how people are feeling. There are a lot more people on Sean than I thought there would be, because I was kind of thinking, oh, I'll pick Merab, but now Merab's doing all this weird stuff, like he's posting photos that he's got staph infection, and a lot of people like that claim to be experts on staph infection are saying that it's really bad, and then he's kind of pulling those stitches out of his eye. Like, are these pre-recorded videos? Like, is he just doing that to annoy us? Like what's really going on? And all of these little things kind of put doubts in my mind. And if he genuinely does have staph infection, that's going to completely change the fight, because Merab's whole style relies on his cardio. He's just a cardio machine. And that's how he wins. It's just by constantly wrestling, constantly outworking his opponents, and just having the better cardio out of the two. But would it matter if Sean O'Malley was just going to knock him out in the first or second round anyway? Probably not. And I am going to go with that, you know. I feel like it's really rolling the dice, even though I think most people are going to pick O'Malley. I do think that this is the dice roll pick, is picking O'Malley, because you look at the wrestler, you think he can get it done. I think O'Malley can get it done, you know. I think that he can get the knockout on Merab. We saw Henry Cejudo, of all people, hurt him on the feet. We've seen Jose Aldo, who's one of the best defensive anti-wrestlers of all time, find success against him on the feet, so no surprise there. Marlon Moraes, 3 years ago now, we're really digging deep now, was able to really hurt him on the feet. I think O'Malley can hurt him on the feet, man, and I'm very shocked that 69% of people are picking O'Malley. Very appropriate number for him, as he has 69 tattooed on his shoulder, but yeah, wow, 69% of people are picking O'Malley. Quite surprised by that, I'll be honest with you, but let me know what you think in the comments below. Just to clarify, I am going to pick O'Malley. I'm going to pick O'Malley by KO, but very low confidence. Very low confidence. Let me know what you think in the comments below.